World War II undoubtedly stands apart in the annals of human history as the largest and most destructive conflict ever waged. Like a merciless whirlwind, it swept across every continent, leaving behind millions of shattered lives and shaping the world we know today. But what caused this outcome? Why did the Allies prevail? Or perhaps a more fitting question would be, why did the Axis powers collapse? By delving into the archives of World War II, we embark on a journey through pivotal events, turning points, and the fates of individuals who determined the outcome of this global drama. Our story begins in the 1920s. At that time, 6 great powers dominated the international stage, but 2 stood out unmistakably as true global superpowers, both of which would later join the Allied cause. Great Britain, mistress of the seas, ruled the largest empire in history, its mighty navy commanding the oceans without rival. The United States, meanwhile, was the wealthiest nation on Earth and the financial hub of the planet. Yet in 1929, the world changed beyond recognition. The global economy collapsed into the depths of crisis, and both Britain and the US effectively withdrew from the world stage. In this chaos, nationalist governments sprang up worldwide like mushrooms after rain, most prominently in Germany and Japan. Their new leaders harbored grand ambitions to build empires from which they could draw resources and elevate themselves to superpower status. Crucially, they were prepared to go to war to realize this vision. In stark contrast, the policies of Britain, France, and the United States were bent on avoiding war at all costs. The US passed neutrality laws, obliging it to stay out of any future conflict, while Britain pursued a strategy famously known as appeasement. Though widely criticized, here in the World War II galleries, you can see the Anglo-German Declaration signed by Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and Adolf Hitler, a document drafted after the Munich Conference where Britain and France agreed to Hitler's annexation of German-speaking regions of Czechoslovakia in the hope of preserving peace. Chamberlain genuinely believed this agreement would secure peace for our time. Less than a year later, however, he would declare war on Germany. This new era of conflict had actually begun in 1931, when Japan invaded Manchuria and soon became embroiled in a full-scale war with China. Japanese forces advanced rapidly, but the vastness of Chinese territory and fierce resistance denied them lasting control. By 1939, Japan's military resources were exhausted. During this time, Japanese troops committed countless atrocities against civilians they deemed racially inferior. Up to 20 million Chinese perished during World War II. Meanwhile, in Europe, Germany began rebuilding its military might and expanding its territory, first the Rhineland, then Austria, and in 1938, the Sudetenland. It was at this moment that Hitler signed the aforementioned Anglo-German Declaration, assuring the world his ambitions were satisfied. Yet the following year, he annexed the rest of Czechoslovakia, an act that proved decisive. Despite their military unpreparedness, Britain and France now pledged to defend Poland. When Germany invaded in September 1939, Europe was plunged into total war. Then, in a shocking turn, the Soviet Union joined forces with Germany to invade Poland from the east. Though communist Soviets and fascist Germans were ideological enemies, they temporarily set aside their differences in 1939 to 1940 to redraw the map of Europe. The Soviets occupied the Baltic states. Meanwhile, Germany captured Denmark and Norway before achieving one of the war's most stunning victories. Using advanced blitzkrieg tactics, German forces overran France and the Low Countries in just 6 weeks. Britain now stood dangerously exposed. During the evacuation from Dunkirk, British troops escaped aboard small civilian vessels, but left behind nearly all their heavy equipment. It seemed the German war machine was unstoppable, and Britain stood alone, isolated and vulnerable. Yet this was not entirely true. Britain received crucial support from its empire and dominions, from the United States and from governments in exile based in London. Germany expected Britain to surrender, but to Hitler's dismay, the new British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, resolved to fight on. Britain still held key defensive advantages: the English Channel as a vital barrier, the Royal Navy, though stretched thin, remained the world's largest, and the Royal Air Force possessed a sophisticated air defense network and modern fighter aircraft. Together, they kept Germany at bay and thwarted any invasion. Britain remained in the war. It was then that Germany, Japan, and Italy formalized their alliance, becoming the Axis powers. At that moment, their prospects appeared promising. Beneath the surface, however, serious problems festered. Italy's attempt to build a new Roman Empire in North Africa and the Balkans floundered. Its invasions of Greece and Egypt ended in failure. Germany's newly acquired European territories were blockaded by the Royal Navy, and critical supplies dwindled. In fact, Germany faced such severe shortages of food and oil that its pact with the Soviet Union was the only thing keeping it afloat. #! At META, quote, pause, quote, colon, quote, sex, quote, colon, 2.0. Similarly, Japan's 1940 occupation of French Indochina, aimed at cutting off Chinese supply lines, triggered furious reactions from the United States, was already shaping the war's course. Japanese brutality in China had outraged American public opinion, shifting sentiment decisively. In response to Japan's move into Indochina, the US imposed an embargo on oil and steel exports. When Britain and the Netherlands followed suit, Japan suddenly lost access to 94% of its imported oil. At the same time, the US was rapidly expanding its military capacity. Though still neutral on paper, it was already supplying vital war materiel exclusively to the Allies. The Lend-Lease Act soon formalized this support, enabling the free transfer of aircraft, ships, food, and clothing. This flood of American aid became a formidable challenge for the Axis. Under mounting pressure, both Japan and Germany faced existential threats. Japan risked running out of oil and losing the war in China, while Germany feared the growing power of its old rival, the Soviet Union. Stalemate was no longer an option. In 1941, both powers chose to gamble everything. Despite their vulnerabilities, they escalated the war in a desperate bid to seize the resources they needed. In June 1941, Germany betrayed its Soviet ally and launched the largest invasion force in military history into the USSR. Victory required a swift, lightning campaign, but Nazi ideology dismissed Slavic peoples as racially inferior, leading to a catastrophic underestimation of Soviet resilience. Hitler famously declared, "We need only kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will collapse." This arrogance would prove fatal. The Soviets mobilized on an unprecedented scale, relocating entire factories beyond the Ural Mountains to sustain war production, churning out weapons like the M30 howitzer to repel the invaders. Soviet citizens sacrificed their lives in staggering numbers. Ultimately, 25 million perished in what they called the Great Patriotic War. Germany needed a quick victory. By December 1941, the German advance stalled just miles from Moscow. their grand gamble had failed. Almost simultaneously, Japan launched its own offensive, not against the Soviets, but toward resource-rich Southeast Asia. Recognizing that such a move would inevitably draw the US into the war, Japan struck first, with a surprise attack on the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. The assault succeeded, and Japan swiftly seized control of the territories and resources it coveted. Believing Americans to be soft and unwilling to endure heavy losses, Japanese leaders hoped fierce defense of these gains would force the US to negotiate. Instead, the attack united the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union in a common resolve. Only the unconditional surrender of the Axis would be acceptable. After Pearl Harbor, American isolationism vanished overnight. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin agreed on a strategy of relentless attrition, on land, sea, and in the air, leveraging their overwhelming advantages in manpower, material, and industrial capacity. The ungainly-looking B-24 Liberator bomber, on display nearby, embodied this industrial might. At its peak, the Willow Run plant in Michigan produced one B-24 every 63 minutes. The tide of war was turning. By 1942, Allied codebreakers had penetrated German and Japanese ciphers, enabling critical victories. At the Battle of Midway, US aircraft sank 4 Japanese carriers, crippling Japan's offensive naval power. On the Eastern Front, Germany's last desperate push to capture the Caucasus oil fields was shattered at Stalingrad, the war's bloodiest battle, where Soviet forces encircled and annihilated an entire German army. The Axis had gambled on quick triumphs. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a war of attrition they could not win. Now the Allies set out to convert the so-called Battle of the Atlantic was not a single clash like Trafalgar, but a grueling, years-long struggle. Germany deployed U-boats to starve Britain into submission, sinking millions of tons of Allied shipping, losses that peaked in 1942 during what German submariners called their second happy time. But the Allies turned the tide. They replaced losses with mass-produced Liberty ships, 3 every 2 days at peak output, and refined convoy tactics with better naval escorts. Technological innovations followed. Long-range aircraft like the Liberator closed the Atlantic air gap. Sonar and radar tracked submarines, and weapons like the Hedgehog mortar destroyed them. By 1943, the Allies had decisively won the Battle of the Atlantic, tightening a noose of blockade around the Axis. As Japan tried to ferry resources from its new empire back to the home islands, American submarines and aircraft mercilessly hunted its convoys. Fuel shortages became critical, forcing Japan to shorten pilot training, a fatal flaw that left its aviators easy prey for better-trained Allied crews. Allied forces now launched coordinated offensives, island hopping across the Pacific toward Japan, liberating Ukraine and knocking Italy out of the war. These advances brought them within striking distance of the Axis heartlands, enabling devastating air campaigns. British and American air forces subjected Nazi Germany to round-the-clock bombing, the RAF by night flattening urban centers, the US Army Air Forces by day precision striking industrial targets. Losses were heavy. Here you can see the tail section of a German Bf-110 night fighter flown by ace Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, who shot down 121 unescorted British bombers. Yet the bombing campaign forced Germany to disperse aircraft production across countless small factories, sacrificing efficiency. Luftwaffe fighters were lured into the air by decoy bomber formations, escort fighters. In this war of exhaustion, the Allies prevailed. American bombers also unleashed firestorms on Japan, using incendiary weapons to reduce entire cities to ashes. Hundreds of thousands of Axis civilians perished in these strategic bombing campaigns. 1944 also marked the peak of the Holocaust, the Nazi regime's monstrous campaign to exterminate Europe's Jews. 6 million Jews were starved, shot, or worked to death in a grotesque system that fed Germany's warped war economy. That summer, the Allies landed in Normandy on D-Day, beginning the liberation of Western Europe. Simultaneously, the Soviet Union launched Operation Bagration, a colossal offensive that shattered German forces in the east. Both campaigns succeeded spectacularly. The Allies not only outnumbered the Germans in troops and tanks, but also enjoyed superior logistics, supplying their armies with trucks, while the Axis still relied heavily on horse-drawn transport. Allied leadership had learned the lessons of modern warfare. Early in the war, the Germans had empowered frontline commanders with significant autonomy, a doctrine that delivered stunning success in the 1940 campaign against France. For comparison, Stalin appointed himself Supreme Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet forces. His epaulets are displayed here. However, as the war progressed, Stalin increasingly trusted the counsel of his generals, a shift that led to improved military outcomes. Meanwhile, Hitler moved in the opposite direction. He became ever more convinced of his own strategic genius. "I walk the path dictated by Providence with the confidence of a sleepwalker," he declared. Hitler repeatedly denied his field commanders requests for strategic withdrawals, a policy that had catastrophic consequences for the German army. As a result, the Allies steadily gained ground. The war's outcome was essentially decided, yet the most striking manifestation of this refusal was the self-sacrifice of young Japanese pilots ordered to crash their explosives-laden aircraft into Allied naval vessels, a tactic known as kamikaze attacks. This relentless determination to fight to the death stemmed from a deep-seated belief that surrender was dishonorable. Consequently, suffering and bloodshed continued unabated. Adolf Hitler pinned his hopes on German Vergeltungswaffen, vengeance weapons, such as the Phi-1 rocket displayed here. He believed the destruction and civilian casualties inflicted by these weapons would terrorize Allied populations and compel their leaders to sue for peace. This, however, was a grave miscalculation. Vast resources diverted to Phi weapon production came at the expense of urgently needed tanks and fighter aircraft. Moreover, tens of thousands of forced laborers perished under horrific conditions in underground factories while building these weapons. In stark contrast, the Allies invested heavily in developing an entirely new, era-defining weapon of decisive impact, the atomic bomb. By May 1945, crushed between advancing forces from the east and west, Germany was forced to capitulate. Japan, however, fought on, until the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the Soviet Union invaded Manchuria. It then became unmistakably clear that further resistance was futile. In August 1945, World War II ended in Allied victory. The Allies possessed overwhelming advantages in natural resources and population, fundamental pillars of total war. Yet this superiority alone did not guarantee victory. Through indomitable spirit and tenacious resistance, they overcame early setbacks to persevere. They coordinated a vast strategic framework and, often through painful experience, mastered the demands of modern warfare. They also successfully mobilized their populations for immense effort and sacrifice. The peoples of the Allied nations demonstrated unwavering resolve and resilience, whether fighting the Axis powers, manufacturing the countless items required by mechanized warfare, or serving in numerous support roles. On Victory Day, Churchill addressed crowds in London with the words, "This is your victory."